Okay, you guys, if you weren't there, we had such a wonderful time. It was, I said before, it was like a small miracle to get, I think, 5 of the different Messianic congregations together in one place. Many of the musicians from different congregations were all up there. I was there. Troy Mitchell from Beth Emanuel was there. The Corner Fringe guys were there, several of them. We had Jay Christensen on the accordion, kind of a weird one, but it was actually, he's great. It's like super smooth and it adds something nice. It's not like corny, you know, like that. Not like you're dancing or anything, but we had a wonderful time. Mikhail, of course, was there. He'll be with us tomorrow as well, so come out for part 2 of Andrew's teaching, and that gets me to Mr. Andrew Gabriel Roth. Andrew, and I told Jesse to fill in if I miss anything. Andrew perhaps is most famous for his Aramaic English New Testament translation. I've had one for some time, and just like the notes that go into that and all the commentary with it is amazing. I love it. It's a great resource for that reason alone. It's a great resource because you can see what's in the Aramaic as well. He's also, you're a speaker, a scholar in the Messianic world. You also wrote The Wheel of Stars, if I'm not mistaken, so some biblical astronomy. So we're really honored to have Mr. Roth here to speak to us. I'm looking forward to what he has to say. Did I miss anything? All right, I got it all. All right. Yeah, why don't you come on up, and I can set you up with the PowerPoint, and we'll get ready. We'll get going.
Okay. Can everyone hear me okay? All right. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I want to extend a special thank you to Jesse and to Judah for their very persistent, heartfelt invitations that I received over the last year and change.
You were going to try blackmail that.
Yes, I got that. So, really, you guys are a very tough act to follow. I'm a little jealous being a musician myself. You know, the great praise songs, very much enjoyed that soaking music and all of that. So it's great to be here on Shabbat with all of you. So, you know, I can speak to a wide variety of things. And what I thought I would do for this first teaching is to kind of shoot from the hip a little bit, in that I'm not bringing a PowerPoint tonight. But I did want to talk about the Aramaic, because maybe some of you guys have seen the commercial, I guess it's for an insurance company, where they say, you know, they can't put anything on the internet that isn't true. Where'd you hear that? The internet. You know, and unfortunately with respect to Aramaic, there's a lot on the internet that is not true. And so what I thought I would do was I would talk about how Aramaic becomes a biblical language. No, it doesn't completely replace Hebrew as a biblical language. It kind of pulls up alongside the Hebrew. How that happened historically. And then once I do that, I'd like to show you some examples of what we call Aramaic New Testament primacy. Now, in a nutshell, Aramaic New Testament primacy is the belief that the New Testament, for at least 22 of the 27 books that were preserved in the Middle East, were originally written in the Aramaic language. This isn't to say that the Greek comes too much later. It's more of a complicated issue than just saying this came before that. It's really more a matter of saying Eastern languages go east and Western languages go west. And if we think about it that way, the church loves to tell the story of Paul going west. They forget Paul's boss, Peter. He founded more assemblies going east. But we don't hear the story of Peter going east. We don't hear the story of Peter writing from Babylon, his epistle, which he says directly in 1 Peter 5:13. So what I'm trying to do is to get all the ancient witnesses to come to the table. I think it's better to have more witnesses supporting the word than less. And while the Greek has been very important in a lot of ways, and actually helps me in many ways, it's not the only game in town. So let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to the time of David, 1000 BCE, and talk about Hebrew and Aramaic and how it became a biblical language. And then, I'll try and also leave time for some Q&A. You can ask me anything that you want, any biblical question you want. Doesn't necessarily have to be about what I'm talking about right now. It can be about calendar or astronomy, biblical astronomy. It can be about, prophecy, stuff in Daniel, stuff in Revelation, whatever. I do all of those things. But let's stay on point and talk about the history of Aramaic, starting from King David's time. I'm talking exclusively about Tanakh, Old Testament, until I directly mention the New Testament, just so that we can stay on track. See, in 1000 BC or so, David finally takes Jerusalem. And that is the turning point in his time as king. And he sets up what started as a tribal confederation becomes a real power, a nation state. And these people are speaking Hebrew, down to the last one of them. Hebrew that they learned from Moses. People want to know, does it go back to Abraham? It might not. Abraham could have spoken a language called Akkadian, which is a very, very ancient language of the Sumerians, because he was from the remains of the Sumerian Empire that later became the Assyrian Empire and the Babylonian Empire, and that's a whole, discussion in and of itself. But very early on, the Hebrew people picked up the Hebrew language, they made it their own, and it became their national identity. And for many of those people, they would have preferred that no other language exist for their scriptures other than Hebrew. Because only Hebrew, in their opinion, was God-breathed, Elohim-breathed. But, see, Hebrew and Aramaic are sort of twin sons from the same mother. You have a very ancient person named Aber, who was in the generations going from Noah to Abraham. And he's where we get the word Hebrew from. But we also have Aram, the son of Shem, in Genesis 10, who's where you get the word Aramaic from. So Hebrew and Aramaic go back very, very far, equally far. But let's stay focused on David, because I said that's where our real focus was from. Everyone is speaking Hebrew in David's time and in Solomon's time, Rehoboam, and then, of course, as we know, in the 5th year of Rehoboam, there is a split. And, a bunch of tribes go north with their capital at Samaria, and Judah, Levi, and Benjamin stay in the south for the kingdom of Judah. Now, during the reign of King Hezekiah, in 700 BC, an Assyrian guy named Sennacherib wants to attack Judah. He has already been very successful at kicking the butt of the northern Israelite kingdom 22 years earlier. And from that time, he's basically something like 30-0 in all the places that he conquers. The Assyrians are brutal, even by the standards of the time. Whereas Babylon kind of wants to love you into submission, to make you want to be them, Assyria wants to just break your spirit and make you feel lower than the dust. So when the Assyrians come in, and they are an Aramaic-speaking people, what do? They take 99% of the northern kingdom, the Israelite kingdom, goes into Assyria. So they start speaking Aramaic. Then they send their own Assyrian people to repopulate the devastated country. And over time, the very, very few Israelite people that remained interbreed with these Assyrian people, and they become a hybrid race called the Samaritans. And so in the north, you have Aramaic being transplanted by force because of this. Now we fast forward 22 years later to King Hezekiah, and Hezekiah is having a really bad day. Hezekiah is ill. He thinks he's going to die. And he looks out of his window and he sees, 185,000 Assyrian invaders. That's a bad day, folks, right? So he looks out there and it's like, even someone as steadfast as Hezekiah must have thought, oh boy, we are in for it. And so there's a delegation that is sent from King Sennacherib. They send a letter that basically reads like this: Dear Hezekiah, King of Judah, don't think that your Elohim will save you. None of the dozens of people that we conquered had their God save them. Yours won't save you. Open the gates and maybe we let you live. Love, Sennacherib. Is basically the letter that he gets. Now, what does this have to do with Aramaic? The delegation that Hezekiah sent to talk to the representatives of the Assyrians says something very key. I believe it's in 2 Kings 19. He says, speak to us in Aramaic, for we understand it. But do not speak with us in Hebrew. And the reason they do that is because they've had to learn Aramaic because everyone around them is speaking Aramaic. So, of course, the ambassador corps, the administration for the king of Judah, is going to have to know Aramaic. But the common people don't know yet. And so the fear is if they speak in Hebrew, everyone's going to panic. Because they're going to basically say, okay, in Hebrew, you surrender. And they didn't want that. So, excuse me.
What's the scripture reference in there? I remember reading that.
I think it's around 2 Kings 19. I think that's where it is. So, if not, try 1 Kings 19, but I'm pretty sure it's 2 Kings 19. So, here you have Israel learning Aramaic, having to know Aramaic in order to deal with the nations around them. But they are still thoroughly speaking Hebrew. But not for long. Judgment Day comes for them. On July 11th, otherwise known as the 9th of Av, in 586 BC, Babylon comes a-calling. Nebuchadnezzar invades. And Nebuchadnezzar takes the Jewish people, the Judahite people, into captivity. And Babylon is an Aramaic-speaking country. So 70 years, they're in Babylon. So what's going to happen when that time is up and they come back? They will have had to, you would think that they could have just been isolated and kept everything pure, but that's not what happened. We know that didn't happen because Jeremiah kind of gave them weird advice. Jeremiah comes into Babylon and he says, first thing I want you to do, stop crying. Second thing I want you to do is basically to settle down with these people. Plant vineyards. Go into business with these people. Right? And pray for the welfare of the king and for the city, because when they do well, you do well. So that kind of meant that it was okay for them to get used to speaking Aramaic. And in fact, one of the places where Aramaic shows up in the Hebrew Bible is a line in Jeremiah, which is completely Aramaic. Okay? A lot of people don't know that. Now, the books that are written just before the Babylonian captivity and into the time of the Babylonian captivity, books like Daniel and Ezra, right? These books, when they reach final form, about a third of each of those books is in the Aramaic language. And there's no doubt about that. It's not a matter of interpretation. It's very, very clear to anyone who reads Hebrew that all of a sudden you're missing the word the. Like the word ha, the, in Hebrew, all of a sudden you're reading in Daniel, where's my the? It disappeared. I must have gotten a defective text from Zondervan. No, you switched over into Aramaic. Okay? So that's how we know. And there's a lot of peculiarities like that in Aramaic. But that's just the easiest one for me to explain. So, you now have Aramaic as part of the Hebrew corpus of what we are calling the Tanakh. Okay? It is represented. It is a minority representation. Yes, please. Thank you. It's a minority representation, but it's an important one. Because we need to understand how we go from no Aramaic under David to our Savior being a native Aramaic speaker who does Hebrew on Shabbat. How does that happen? Well, there's a lot of history that goes on in that 1,000 years. That's why we're going through this. And that's why I'm giving as many biblical references as I possibly can. So, thank you, appreciate that. Yeah, that's great. So anyway, while that's going on, you also have the fact that not every Jew returned from Babylon. In fact, up to 90% of the people who went into captivity did not go back to Judah. Oh, you see, some of you are surprised. They don't exactly advertise that fact, do they? Where do you guys think the Talmud came from? Right? It came from Babylon because most of the Jews stayed there.
It's kind of like today, you know, a lot of Jews that stayed in America. Or
Exactly. And what was also interesting, and that's a great point, the version of that back then, 2,000 years ago, was in addition to staying in Babylon, they went all over Asia Minor, these Jewish communities. From 500 BC all the way to the time of Yeshua, you have Jews setting up communities in Alexandria, Egypt. You've got Jews setting up communities all over Syria, all over, like in places where Paul would write his letters. Corinth, Thessaly. All those places have synagogues. Paul wrote to those synagogues. That's how we know they're there. This is where those Jews came from. But for those Jews, it isn't Hebrew or Aramaic that they're dealing with. It's Greek. So how does Greek come into this? Again, just talking about the Tanakh, the Old Testament, not even touching the New Testament yet. Well, this is what happened. There was this guy, you may have heard of him, his name is Alexander the Great. Yeah, nice guy, kind of ambitious.
died young, didn't he?
Yes, and we won't say what he died of either, because he was just a little too friendly. Anyway, Alexander did not have a legitimate heir to pass it on. He didn't believe in settling down and marrying someone. So he divided his empire amongst his 4 generals. And one of those generals got Egypt. And his name was Ptolemy. And that general becomes the last dynasty of the ancient Egyptians. That dynasty ends with a lady named Cleopatra, kind of having a little thing with a snake and poisoning herself and dying, and that's the end of pharaonic Egypt after 3,000 years. So, the son of this general was a guy named Ptolemy II, or Ptolemy Philadelphus, as he's sometimes called. And he's got this really intense library. Excuse me. I caught myself. Right? He's got this library at Alexandria where there is a significant Jewish population. And that library's got 2 million books. It is by far the greatest repository of ancient learning that ever existed. If I told you some of the stuff that we lost from that library being burned, you wouldn't recover. I mean, the stuff that they had compared to what survived is just, it's heartbreaking. I'll give you one quick example. Because the card catalog of this library survived. They had a list of their titles that was kind of underground that survived the fires, and it had the list of their titles. And one of the little titles said, and Aristarchus of Samos proved that the earth revolved around the sun. And he did it about 2,000 years before a guy named Copernicus was even born. Yeah, wouldn't you like to have gotten hold of that book? Wouldn't that have saved us some time in the Middle Ages if we had this book? Galileo, Catholic Church, hello? Okay? But no, it went up in flames. And the only thing I know about Aristarchus of Samos is what was in the card catalog. So this king, he wants to have the best literature in the world. He has had friendships with prominent aristocratic Jews because Jews helped establish that city. Jews were friends to Alexander the Great himself, okay, and helped set that city up. And because of that, they got special privileges. And that's all in the historian Josephus. Now, so he wants a copy in the Greek language of the first 5 books of our Bible, the Torah. It had never been put into Greek before. And so the story goes that 72 scholars came in from Jerusalem. The legend says that it was a complete miracle that every single one of them had a word-for-word translation of the scripture. If so, that unity has not survived, but that's the story they like to tell. Excuse me. So, the Jews allowed this because, one, this was a king who was making this request. So you want to stay on the good side of the king. Number 2, if their literature is well understood, they might not be persecuted quite so much. So this was in their best interest to allow this translation to come into Greek. But then something happened that nobody could foresee. And that was that Greek version got super popular because all the Jews in Alexandria wanted a copy. So now, all of a sudden, there is an explosion of interest in Alexandria, and then these Jewish communities that are spread out across Asia Minor, they all want copies. And now, all of a sudden, the Torah is cool, you see. But only in Greek for these people. They begin to rely on their Hebrew less and less, and the Greek more and more. And so that's where Hellenistic Judaism comes from. And their canon is different from the Jews in Israel. They got more books. Some of them you may have heard of. They're called the Apocrypha. Or you may have heard of the Book of Enoch. Comes from there. See? So here you have these 3 traditions flying around. The Jews in Babylon, they've got their Aramaic liturgy. And they will, at this point, have an Aramaic Old Testament called Peshet Tanakh. They will compile the Talmud and a lot of other books, famous Jewish books like the Zohar and the Kabbalah. That's all in Aramaic. from there. That's where that literature comes from, for better or for worse. Right? But just saying, this is where this stuff comes from. So that's number one. Then you have the Greek-speaking Jews with what we will broadly call the Septuagint, but it's going to take another 200 years before the rest of the Old Testament is translated into Greek. So I should point that out. They didn't get it all done in one shot. And then you have the Jews in Israel who are clinging to their Hebrew tradition. But a funny thing happens to that Hebrew tradition when the Jews return from captivity from Babylon. They decide to basically change everything. Now, they don't change the word itself. They don't, I believe that the word has been intact from the moment Moshe wrote it down. But what they did change, that whole paleo alphabet they've been using for thousands of years, Ezra said, nah, getting rid of it. So the whole paleo script, the whole paleo dialect, they got rid of it. Nobody knows why. I've tried to figure out. I was like, was Ezra just having a bad day? I don't know. But they replaced it, and here's a dirty little secret. What you view as Hebrew script, square script, is an Aramaic alphabet. If you ask any rabbi, what is the name of the writing style in the Torah scrolls today, they will tell you it is Katav Ashuri, which means Assyrian writing. So for whatever reason, Ezra decided to take this Aramaic script from the Assyrians and take the traditions and the scriptures that they already had and transliterate it systematically across the board. As Ezra does this, certain Aramaic terms slip in to the so-called Hebrew text. And that's why we see that there is these Aramaic phrases that pop in and out of nowhere. That's probably because of the editing process that Ezra has gone through. So is all this making sense so far? Okay. So I'm going to continue for a little bit, and then I'll see if there's any questions. But I want to make sure this foundation is clear. So the Jews in Israel then decide that the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, is absolutely the worst thing that's ever happened to their people. So they found out the Hebrew day that the Septuagint was completed on, and they made it a fast day. This was enforced during Yeshua's time. So they mourned for the temples, and they mourned the day the Septuagint was created, because the Torah could not adequately be translated. But at the same time, you need translations. So there is this very schizophrenic thing going on that, okay, translations are okay, but only, if no one's watching me reading one. You see this very much in the writings of Josephus, where on the one hand, Josephus, who is a descendant of priests and kings in the first century, eyewitness to all things ancient Jewish, including calendar and the language. And Josephus says, on the one hand, he brags. He does what we call in Yiddish, he likes to cavell. He likes to uplift himself a little bit. And he goes, nobody could have put these teachings from Hebrew into Greek better than me. I've taken considerable efforts to learn all the learning of the Greeks and, combine it with my superior understanding of my own people. So on the one hand, he's bragging. But on the other hand, he'll say, yeah, but you know what? I've been living in Rome for 30 years. I still don't think I pronounce Greek that well. And also, my people frown. They don't like us to learn the languages of other people. The common saying that's in the Talmud said, kind of sum this up. Cursed is he who raises swine, and cursed is he who teaches his son Greek. Okay? So this kind of sums up, it's a contradictory thing, because in other places in the Jewish tradition, they will say that Greek is the only other language you can translate the scriptures into. But apparently those later rabbis didn't consult with the ones who came before them. And this is what the Talmud is. It is an argument that takes place over 1,200 years, and people act like it's the same argument in the same room at the same time. So people kind of forget what was decided on earlier and go, whatever, no, we're doing this. So this is the environment that we have to deal with when dealing with the New Testament. Yes, there were Greek-speaking Jews outside of Israel. Okay? There were Jews who read the Septuagint outside of Israel. In Israel, they didn't. And where does Yeshua come from? Right. What about Paul? Right. So since we're dealing with the Israeli branch of Judaism, we need to make sure we don't mistake the trends over there for what's happening over here. This is very, very important to understand. So during this time, you have the setting up of the synagogue system, where they codified that text, which has some Aramaic in it. Another common saying from the Talmud says, "Let not the Aramaic be lightly valued or esteemed by you, my son, as the Holy One, blessed be He, has seen fit to bless it in the Torah, in the prophets, and in the writings." All three places. A lot of people don't know that there is an Aramaic line in Genesis. You guys remember when Jacob fled Laban? And Laban caught up with him? And they decided to make a pact, and they had this thing called a witness heap. And it said, and Laban called it Yegar Sachadutha. But Jacob called it Galid. This is in Genesis 32, I think. Somewhere in there. Galid is the Hebrew word for witness. Sahadutha is the Aramaic word for witness. So right there in the original Genesis is an Aramaic phrase, because Laban is an Aramaic speaker. Yegar Sahadutha, witness heap. So you get that. You get a little bit of Aramaic in Jeremiah. So the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, which would include Ezra and Daniel. So the Aramaic is there. And I would argue that, it's more important to admit that it's there and that it's part of the original Hebrew Bible than it is to argue as to how important it is, because how many words of that versus the other. If it made it into the scripture, it counts. It matters. And we need to study these things. Study them out. Okay? So, from this point on, you have Aramaic all over the archaeological record in Israel, all over the language of Israel. Like, for example, has anyone ever gone to a Ben mitzvah? You guys know what a Ben mitzvah would be, son of the commandment. Ben is the Hebrew word for son. But we don't go to Ben mitzvahs, do we, Judah? What do we go to? A bar mitzvah. What's bar? It's exactly. So even Reform Jews, who hardly ever do any feasts and stuff, they're saying bar mitzvah, which is a hybridized Aramaic Hebrew phrase. And they don't even know that they're toggling between the two languages. Because when they read the Torah, there's no warning that says, you are entering an Aramaic zone. It doesn't occur. It's the same Hebrew style letters, the same Hebrew style vowels, taught by the same Hebrew style tradition. So unless you know what to look for, you may feel a little weird when you shift from one mode to the other, but it's not going to jolt you out of your Hebrew thinking.
Is that what they call Mishnaic Hebrew, like
No, well, Mishnaic Hebrew is something that arises outside of the biblical period. So the Mishnaic Hebrew, I want to say 2nd century AD on forwards, to be fair. I think, as you know, they only began the little bits of the Mishnah right towards the end of the 2nd century. So I'm being generous. Make sense? Okay. So this is what happens. Now, Aramaic is the number one spoken language, not just in the Middle East, but in Israel itself. This is the environment into which Yeshua is born. So at this point, I'll just ask if there are any questions about this piece of it before I get into showing the primacy proofs. But that's basically part one. Any questions? Oh, really? Okay, yes? The what? The Mathra?
I'm saying it wrong. The Masoretic text, is that okay.
The Mazorah? Or the Mikra, the received text.
Gematria.
Gematria?
Gematria is numerical. Yeah.
Okay. Well, obviously, the codes have always been there. You know, we can look at the growth of modern Jewish mysticism and say, well, it's this dude from Lithuania, or it's this guy from Spain, you know, or the Kabbalah was written only in the year 1300. Excuse me. But we know those traditions go back much, much further. And the historian Philo wrote about, and this is a guy from the 1st century AD, he said, it is unwise to teach the uninitiated the secret mystical mysteries. And the ironic thing is that he turns out being one of the earliest references to the mysticism. So if Philo had just kept his mouth shut, we wouldn't even know that they were doing Jewish mysticism or some form of it in the 1st century. But I would also argue that mystical traditions, including Gematria, and Gematria basically is where the letters are numbers. In Hebrew, the letters are literally also numbers. And so each word adds up to a mathematical total. And if two mathematical words were said to have the same value, they were said to be related. I think that that type of tradition has been going on all along, but kind of secretly, underground. And so I'm not surprised that there isn't a whole lot of manuscript evidence, because they were trying to keep it secret. You see what I'm saying? Now, in terms of the way that morphed later, you have these guys who were well trained in mysticism who are known as the Masoretes. And around 500 AD, they begin this task of standardizing and collating the Hebrew that they had into a final form that we have every Torah scroll in today. And they used Gematria to help them. The reason was that when they made their changes, they added up the numerical value of every letter on a line of text. And they had notes that said, this Genesis 1:1 needs to add up to 256. If it doesn't add up to 256, you've missed a letter. And that was how they were able to make sure that letter-for-letter accuracy was passed down in the tradition. And this is why, when the Dead Sea Scrolls version of Isaiah was unearthed, big surprise, it was letter for letter, very, very nearly identical to the Masoretic version that had been preserved with 99.99% accuracy because of that gematria, that numerical checking system to make sure each manuscript read that way. By the way, a very similar level of accuracy exists for the Aramaic New Testament manuscripts. But can anyone tell me what the least organized, least unified group of biblical manuscripts in history is? Thank you. Yes, no two Greek manuscripts read alike. They call them families of manuscripts. Well, they're dysfunctional families of manuscripts, actually. And anyone who has really looked into these readings knows exactly what I'm talking about. That's why these guys, Westcott and Hort, came along the scene in 1881 to stitch together a standardized text, because obviously in the 19th century there was no standardized Greek New Testament text. So, does that help answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes?
Just a comment. I like the way that you explained the Greek-speaking Jews, because you see that pop up all throughout the New Testament. Like, who the heck are these guys, and why are they like Greek-speaking Jews, and how did they?
Right.
It makes total sense that they were out of the Babylonian diaspora.
Yeah.
And even in the New Testament, Yeshua was speaking to the Pharisees. And he's like, "Well, where I'm going to go, soon you can't follow me." And I'm like, "What? Everybody's going to commit suicide or something?" Like Greek diaspora. So I mean, that makes sense. I never realized that's where that came from.
Yep.
That's a good point.
Okay. Yes, Judah?
Reaction is something I saw over the years a month or two ago related to Hebrew. Benjamin Netanyahu and the Pope was visiting Israel, and kind of in a camera moment, someone happened to catch. Benjamin Netanyahu said to the Pope, Paul was in this land and spoke Hebrew, and Yeshua was in this land and spoke Hebrew, and the Pope stopped him and said, no, you didn't speak Hebrew, you spoke Aramaic.
He spoke both.
So the press reported that, that's the consensus.
Yes, and it's very evident, ironically, and this is what, people think I want to get everyone to burn their Greek New Testament. The Greek really helps us here, because the Greek will occasionally preserve the sounds of Yeshua's Aramaic words. And when you have the sounds preserved, you know the dialect. For example, remember when in Mark 5, verse 41, Yeshua sees a little girl that has died, and he lays hands on her, and what does he say? Talitha kume. Well, Talitha is not a Hebrew word. It's an Aramaic word. If he was speaking Hebrew, he would have said Neara kume, depending upon the girl's age. He could have used a number of other Hebrew words, like maybe 3 others. But it's not Neara or Alma. It's Talitha. Now, the fact that it's Talitha tells us the dialect, because only Eastern Aramaic has it as Talitha. If it were Western Aramaic, it might be something like Talithoa or Talitho. Okay? So that tells us, yes, Yeshua was speaking Aramaic exclusive phrases, and this is the dialect that he was speaking them in. So that's why, the Greek can be a great friend. And that's why having, it's good to have more ancient witnesses than fewer. Any other questions before I get to primacy? Yes, Judah?
Question and a follow-up. Why in the first century did they speak Hebrew only, say, on Shabbat, or as opposed to all of them? Just because they had adopted the language?
Yes. I would say that if you were aristocratic, you might have been speaking Hebrew most of the time. But if you are a working person, if you're a farmer, if you're a fisherman, like 5 of the disciples were, then you're going to be speaking Aramaic. That's sort of the poor man's language, okay? I wouldn't have you think that Hebrew got relegated to such an extent that it was only spoken on Shabbat, but it was, in terms of the language of the common person, it was Aramaic. And that's because what we have is these Targums. Have you guys heard of the Targums? The whole point that you had these Aramaic paraphrases of the scripture coming out tells us that the Hebrew was getting a little obsolete. They needed help.
It's like King James.
No, not quite. Now, see this gentleman. Okay, go ahead.
It was mainly in Jerusalem where they would speak Hebrew, and then as you got further out from Jerusalem, into the, like you were saying, into the common folks out in the countryside, they would speak.
Right, but there is a slightly different dialectical aspect to the Aramaic that was spoken in Jerusalem to the ones that was spoken by Yeshua in Galilee. And so there's another wrinkle to that. Yes, sir? Well, the archaeology, there's inscriptions from various cemeteries. There are Bar Kokhba letters that are written in Aramaic. There are Dead Sea Scrolls fragments that are written in Aramaic as well as in Hebrew. There have been coins that are written in Aramaic. So it's basically all over the place. Yes, they did. Absolutely. Well, you're talking again about the Essenes, or we think the Essenes. We're talking about there's a difference between what sectarians in the desert do, who are in a distinct minority, and what is prevailing at the temple culture in Jerusalem. You have to remember what happened to the Zadokites. That you had the original priest, for example, just to give one example, who've been serving for 800 years after David, right? Maccabean revolt comes about, the Hasmoneans take over, and they want to be both kings and high priests. So what do? They kick those Zadokites out and they go into the desert. Those Zadokites join the Essenes, they set up their own sacrificial system in the desert. And yes, that system becomes very Hebrew-centric because they believed they were the true Hebrews. They believed they were the sons of light. They believed that their mitzvot were going to usher in the end of days. So they're going to cling a lot harder to the Hebrew traditions than the people who were in the countryside, who were speaking Aramaic by leaps and bounds, and the people in the synagogue system who had adopted Aramaic and were targeting between Hebrew and Aramaic all the time. And that targeting tradition, we know that it happened. The Targums are proof that happened. Onkelos, Jonathan, Neophiti, and all of these others that arose from this period of time. Okay? Whereas in Acts chapter 10, you know that they're targeting even in Greek for Cornelius. He's going to synagogue and he's learning in Greek. But the services would have been in Hebrew and Aramaic. Now I grant you, talking about linguistics and the way languages cross-pollinate, and the cultural influences is not going to be as cut and dried as any one of us would want us to be. It's a bit of a fuzzy business. But basically, through everything that we can determine, from Scripture, from inscriptions that have been found in the archaeological record, from all these other things in archaeology, we can tell that Aramaic was the lingua franca of the Middle East. And we need to be serious about this, because even if you could say it was somehow less prominent in Israel, Where were the people following Yeshua from? Were they from Israel? Not all of them. They were from Syria. They were from Lebanon. They were from the Decapolis. And guess what they're speaking in those places? Not Hebrew. So we have to kind of look at a whole variety of factors, and that's where I draw those conclusions from. And that's where I believe the vast majority of biblical scholars also draw those conclusions from. Does that help? Yep. That's a great point. You're totally right. However, there's a big difference between commercial fluency, political expediency, and sacred choice. Consider, if I go to a synagogue in Warsaw, Poland, what language is the Torah scroll in? What language would the Torah scroll be in? Polish? Hebrew. If I go to a synagogue in West Africa, is it going to be in Swahili or is it going to be in Hebrew? Right? If I go to Cleveland, is the Torah scroll going to be in English or is it going to be in Hebrew? Jews could speak Greek. I got no trouble with that. They could do it then, they could do it now. Paul was not so great at it though. And he says so, but that's another story. But what was the scripture venerated in? What were their Torah scrolls written in? What were their prayers and their liturgy written in? Hebrew. And within that Hebrew umbrella, there's bits of Aramaic. Which is why, I'll get to that in a second, which is why some of the most ancient prayers that we have in Judaism are not Hebrew. Kaddish is an Aramaic prayer. Yishkadav Yishkadash Shemei Rabo. This has got Shlomo and Shalom, the Aramaic and the Hebrew word for peace, right next door to each other. Right? The Amida, the standing prayer, is an Aramaic prayer, not a Hebrew prayer. And that's why the Talmud is an Aramaic work. So there is a fair bit of cross-pollinization between Hebrew and Aramaic, but there are areas that we think of as Hebrew that are actually Aramaic. And I would argue that it is not that the Jews couldn't speak or didn't speak Greek, it's that they didn't do it and write their scriptures in Greek, not in Israel. They rejected Greek in Israel. But what about that New Testament? You see, within the scriptural corpus, I have no doubt that Yeshua used what we would call a Hebrew Tanakh. Okay? I don't think he used a Peshitta or Aramaic Tanakh. I'm pretty sure he used a Hebrew Tanakh, which is very close to our Masoretic text. But the New Testament is a different situation. That's why I'm trying to transition over to the New Testament at this particular point. Okay? Because we need to understand what war and persecution can do. Okay? Yes?
This is an opinion and a question kind of in mind. I'll just throw in this little anecdote. Dr. Michael Brock, who is a linguist of some people, I don't know his quite degree, but he did a review of a book called The Words of Jesus. Done by Jerusalem Institute or something like that.
Okay.
There is a deliberate scholarly bias that runs through the entire book that is, there's no bibliography, don't vet what they say. They state that Mishnah Hebrew explains the similarity between the two when that was not a codified.
Wasn't even around, so that's a ridiculous.
Language after the Greek, but they don't address this. They literally, why do you think there is such resistance to Aramaic?
Well, You might not like my answer. Well, I mean, these are nice people. I don't want to get everyone up in arms and carrying torches and... Oh, yeah, let's put that hurricane back in the box. Sure, no problem. Honestly, I think it comes down to one word: ego. Okay? And this is not just a problem with mainline scholars. This is a problem in our own movement. This is also a problem in Christian scholarship. When I came into this, I lined up 500 examples of what I believe were strong proofs of mistranslations into Greek that could only come from the Aramaic, and specifically from the Peshitta traditions of the Aramaic. 500 of them. So I can go point for point across the whole breadth of the New Testament. And the answers that I get back from the scholars are, well, you know, Metzger doesn't agree with you. Oh, really? Bruce Metzger doesn't agree with me. Does he even know who I am? You know? And that's what they do. It's what we call copy and paste scholarship. So if there's a whole bunch of scholars that agree with me, instead of dealing with your point, and you say, well, Andrew, I got 20 examples that may show your position flawed or needing more erudition, and I just copy and paste what Metzger says and give that to you, I've not addressed your question, have I? And I think that because Aramaic is not well taught, it's not well understood, people don't want to admit that they missed something in their education. And the proof of that is check out as many universities as you like in the United States and in Europe. Especially if they are a Christian school. And if they have a New Testament studies department, try to find out how many of those New Testament studies department deal with Aramaic and how many have Greek. I guarantee you, for every 500 that only look at New Testament Greek, one will look at Aramaic. So let's say you've got your degree program and you've learned your Greek language. You're studying your Greek manuscripts. You're getting degreed from your Greek New Testament college, and you're getting tenure based on your ability to toe the corporate line. Is it any wonder that Greek people, looking only at Greek texts and Greek traditions, see only Greek patterns? And they will fight. They will fight like you wouldn't believe. This is what I think is going on. You know, and so it's easier to dismiss me. I'm just some crank. I don't have a degree. And I'm like, guys, I got news for you. I think that getting a degree is a wonderful thing. But this is my language. From my people. I do not need you to tell me what my people said. I mean, that's ridiculous. You didn't baptize us. We, the Jews, baptized you. This is our language, our culture, our history. And you're going to tell me if it's legitimate or not? Really? But they don't want to do that because it goes against the system. So yeah, I guess you could say I'm fighting the man.
To go back to Dave's question real quick, I mean, it's just like in the first century where Greek was the trade language.
Right.
Essentially, today, English is really the language of commerce and the language of trade, even in Israel. But that doesn't mean that they go and they write English transcripts or speak English
Exactly.
synagogues. They only speak English because they have to deal with us.
Exactly.
That was really the only reason why anything would have been spoken.
Right. I mean, you know, or think about, hate to use this example, but it's the only one that comes to mind. Think about the Pope. Every Christmas, every Easter, the Pope sends out messages in 100 different languages, doesn't he? And yet we know he's only speaking Italian or Latin. So you think that if archaeologists found the remains of these speeches in these different languages, that they would conclude, because they were only digging in Chicago, that the Pope was an English-only speaker. Of course not. That's simply the vernacular language of the location and the people in that period of time. And we need to look at that fact. Languages change over time. They are living, breathing things. And if okay. Well, you want to get into King James, do you? You know, the King James is the same dialect as Shakespeare. How many people understand Shakespeare really well? That's what I thought. You know, so like I got into a dialogue with someone who was a King James only person, and I said, "So tell me what an unction of a mountebank is." And he's like, "A what? Of a what?" And I said, "Well, it's King James English. It's the same dialect that Shakespeare spoke. What is an unction of a mountebank?" He had no idea. I said, "So your salvation is based on the reading of this text, and you don't even understand the dialect." So he was like, "Oh, I guess I understand." 6 months later, he was begging me, "Tell me what an unction of a mountebank is." I was like, "Okay. It means a little bit of poison." That's what it means. Unction, little bit, mountebank, poison. Is the guy in the Laertes going to put poison on his sword so he can kill Hamlet? So, okay. So let me get into the New Testament stuff if I can. Because we could always extend this to Shabbat, after Oneg. All right. I'm going to start with Matthew chapter 1. Now, if some of you have your non-AENT Greek-based Bibles, I recommend you turning to Matthew chapter 1.
You said non-AENT.
Yes, non-AENT, which does include Stern, which is what you have there. Okay, Matthew chapter 1, somewhere around 1:16, it says, there are 14 generations from Abraham to David, 14 generations from David, meaning from Solomon, because David's already counted, to the Babylonian captivity, and 14 generations from after the captivity to Yeshua. Everyone with me? Now, I'll save you all some time. The first two sets, from Abraham to David and from Solomon to Jeconiah, are 14 names and 14 generations. It counts just fine. However, after the captivity, starting with Shealtiel, if you count in that last set, does anyone want to read to me? And I'll put up my fingers, the number of generations in that last set. After the Babylonian captivity. Anyone want to count with me? Who wants to read? Okay.
Netanyahu was the father of...
Right. So Shealtiel's number 1.
Shealtiel was the father of Zerubbabel.
Mm-hmm.
Zerubbabel was the father of Abihud. Abihud was the father of Eliakim. Eliakim was the father of Azur. Azur was the father of Zadok. Zadok was the father of Yachin. Yachin was the father of Eliakim. Eliakim was the father of Eleazar. Eleazar was the father of Matan.
10.
Matan was the father of Yaakov.
Mm-hmm.
Yaakov was the father of Yosef, the husband of Moriah.
How many names? How many did Matthew promise? Where'd the generation go?
They got raptured.
Yeah, that would be good. That's quite a miracle since that term didn't exist prior to the 19th century. Anyway. Yes, Mr. John Darby. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Anyway. All right. In all seriousness, Matthew was promised 14, 14, and 14. First two sets are 14. Last set is only 13. Now, in case you're wondering if that's just another way of the NIV translators trying to take over the world, every single Greek manuscript, every last one of them, from Matthew chapter 1, only has 41 names of 42 that are promised. Every single one. So, what happened? The key is understanding whose lineage Matthew is giving. How many of you have been taught from your previous training in church that Matthew is Joseph's lineage? How many? Show of hands. Matthew's Joseph's lineage and Mary's is Luke's. Well, it's wrong. Okay? First of all, Joseph's seed doesn't count because it's a virgin birth. Now, Joseph's seed is good for getting their inheritance in Bethlehem so that they can go there for the census. But if you look carefully in Luke's lineage, those descendants are not from Solomon. They're from Nathan. Nathan is not a royal son. So, if Luke's is Mary's lineage, then even following the precedent of Zelophehad's daughters, where the women can inherit property and legacy if they marry within their tribe, Yeshua can't sit on the throne because he's only a descendant of Nathan. In order for this to work, the remaining parent, Mary, must be a descendant of Solomon. And the only place Solomon is mentioned in the lineage, Matthew chapter 1. Now here's another proof. If you look in Luke 3:23, see, here's the tricky thing. Luke has decided to list the generations backwards from Matthew. He didn't get the memo. He wasn't at the meeting. Very inconvenient for church people. So Matthew is going from Abraham here, whereas Luke decided, well, here's Yeshua, here's Joseph, and it's going all the way back to Adam and then the son of Yahweh. But if you put the names in the if you reverse the reversing, it says clearly that it's counting from Yeshua, the son of Joseph, not the son of Mary. It says it right there in Luke 3:23. So therefore, Luke's lineage is Joseph's. Matthew's lineage is Mary's. So, right, but it's still going through. If you run it back, if you reverse Luke's reverse order and go a couple of generations, it'll say the son of Heli, the son of Joseph, the son of, who gave birth to Yeshua. It's not mentioning Mary. So how can Luke be Mary's lineage if Mary doesn't even show up? So, this is what happened. We are not talking about one Joseph. We are talking about two. There's one Aramaic word. It's called gaura. Gaura, you have to understand that for all the other generations, all this begetting that's going on, it's Awa, Abba. So-and-so fathered such and such. Until we get to the very end, where it says, Joseph the gaura of Mary. Not Awa, Abba, father. What's going on? See, gaura means protector male. In Middle East society, you ladies have to have a protector male around you your entire lives. It's the law. When you're growing up, your father is your Gaura. When you marry, it's your husband. And when you're old, it will be your son or another male relative. So as a result, Gaura is a word that can mean husband, which is how the Greek took it, and Joseph the Gaura, the husband of Mary. But it also can mean adopted father. Now, Gaura is also associated with a word in Hebrew called Gaal or Goel, which means redeemer. Boaz redeemed Ruth by buying her to marry her. And in the Aramaic translation of the book of Ruth, Boaz is not called a Gaal or a Goel, but a Gaura. So what this is pointing to is a Levirate marriage. That what ended up happening, per Deuteronomy 25, was that Mary's original father died. Right? And so the younger brother, which would have been a man named Joseph, pretty common name in first century, became her protector guardian, her Gaura. And now, without doing any violence to the text, without inserting names that were never there, speculating about lost versions that will never be found, and any other tricks that you may have heard about in the Messianic movement, which is not our Messianic movement, they just mistranslated one word. That's it. So it said, now all of a sudden you have, and Joseph, the adopted father, so Joseph would be 12. Joseph, number 12, the adopted father of Mary, 13, who gave birth to Yeshua, 14. 14, 14, and 14. Only in Aramaic is this possible. And it's an elegant explanation. So that means, no matter how old the Greek version of Matthew 1 is, and let's say it's really old, let's say late first century, Aramaic must be older still, because that's the only way to explain how that error showed up in Greek on Matthew 1. Just like the Greek Old Testament bows down to its Hebrew master, so does the Greek New Testament bow down to its Aramaic master. Yes? Oh, I'm glad you brought it up. Well, let's see. Where was Shem Tov found?
Spain, right?
Oh, yeah, great place for Jewish learning. Right, France, actually, I think. Well, you know, Shem Tov, and while we're at it, let's talk about Deutelet and Munster and all the other manuscripts of medieval Matthew that exist. These were never found in the Middle East. They are all products of late medieval Europe. Not one of them older than the year 1300. That is a fact. Their purpose, as far as we can tell, was to have converted Jews, who often converted at the point of a sword, to write a gospel in Hebrew to get their other Jewish friends to convert to Christianity. Now, when they began to translate from the Greek, they noticed, hey, this Matthew can't count. So what did they do? They added a name. So in the Shem Tov, they added a name that is not in any Greek, any Aramaic version.
Which
I think it was Eliakim in Shem Tov that they added. So this is the thing. Shem Tov, too little, too late, unreliable, and the earliest Greek and Aramaic witnesses predated by 1,000 years. And the Greek and the Aramaic actually agree way more than the Shem Tov does with either of them. Yes?
Do you know what offhand the Hebrew equivalent of Gaura is?
It's hard to say, but it derives from Geber, or Gavura. So it's a strong man or a warrior. Yes, any other questions? So do we see how this one example in Matthew 1 is showing an Aramaic original? Or at least understand where this belief of mine comes from. That I'm not just, pulling it out of thin air. Or did I somehow magically only make sure all your Bibles only had 41 names in them? Now, the Hebrew language doesn't have Gaura. And it's not used in this way. It would be Gaal. But the problem is, if there was a first century Hebrew version of Matthew, it has not survived. It is gone. Okay? Yeah.
The Greek word is andra, which in the Hebrew is ish.
Right. Right. I don't think that ish would be as clear as pointing out the error as Gaura is. Gaura is a very specific Aramaic word that in its precision is not duplicated in Hebrew. Okay? Although it does have a Hebrew root, and there are analogs to some of its usage on the Hebrew side, but in terms of speaking to a levirate situation, no. So, now here's the thing though. A lot of folks are interested in Shem Tov also because of Matthew 23, 1 and 2, where it says, and the scribes and the Pharisees, by the way, they don't sit on the seat of Moses. They sit on the throne of Moses. Kursiya. Okay, seat kind of detracts from the power of that statement. They are sitting, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on the throne of Moses. That's number one. The same word for throne that's in Daniel, in his Aramaic. Now, the reason Shem Tov gets all this attention is because it appears to make more sense than the Greek does. Whereas the Greek will say, that Yeshua said, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on the throne of Moses, therefore everything they say, do. Well, they go, well, he doesn't like the Pharisees. Why would he say everything they say do? Whereas the Shem Tov says everything he says, Moses says, do. Well, first of all, the fact that the reading seems so much clearer is proof of a revision. Number one. Because obviously there would have been a controversy to bring about that change from the Greek and Aramaic manuscripts, which are 1,000 years older. So that's number one. Number two is the fact that we forgot to read the rest of the line. Because the rest of the line says, but do not do as they do, for they say they will do and do not. When you add that piece, the context all of a sudden makes more sense in saying, whatever they say from the seat of Moses, or the throne of Moses do. Because when they are in Moshe's throne, they are doing the written Torah, which is what Yeshua wants them to do. But when they do their oral law and forget that thus you nullify the written Torah to establish your traditions, Matthew 15:2. Did not Moses give you the Torah, yet not one of you lousy Pharisees keeps it? John 7:19. So Yeshua is speaking to the fact that they can do the written Torah right, but they choose not to. Therefore, do not do what they do. Which I think makes much better sense than what Shem Tov has. Any other questions before I give another example? Okay. Well, how about this one? Go to Acts. That's written by Luke. Oh, Luke wrote great Greek. He did write terrific Greek. His Aramaic is way better, though. If you go to Acts 8:27, I want anyone who has a non-AENT to read Acts 8:27. And the reason I'm doing this is because most folks will admit, even on the Christian side, that, with Matthew it's possible to have a Hebrew or Aramaic ancestor. That makes sense. But certainly nothing else. So I'm going to show you that even in the parts of the New Testament where most scholars say could only have been done in compositional Greek is proof of Aramaic origins.
So he got up, went on his way, he caught sight of an Ethiopian eunuch who was minister in charge of the treasure, or queen.
Right.
He had been to Jerusalem to worship.
He had been to Jerusalem to worship. And what is he again? What's the word?
Ethiopian or eunuch.
Eunuch. So a eunuch had worshipped in Jerusalem. Anyone see the problem? Slight problem. Might say it's a cut above the rest. Can eunuchs worship in Jerusalem? Someone go to Deuteronomy chapter 23. No. It says there will be a plaque in the temple. Go to Deuteronomy 23. Verse 1. And the clarifying one in Isaiah says that because they can't worship with their brother Jews, there will be a memorial plaque that is put in their place. But go to the ruling in Deuteronomy 23, verse 1.
With crushed or damaged private parts may not enter the assembly of Yahweh.
Now it doesn't even say temple. It says kahal, the assembly of Yahweh. So that means anywhere there is a gathering of righteous Hebrews, anywhere at all, eunuchs cannot enter into that assembly. Isn't that what it says? So how is it that this eunuch got to worship in Jerusalem with his brother Jews and nobody cared? You see, when I was an anti-missionary, I had a field day with this one. Could you see why? I'd be like, so Luke doesn't even know that eunuchs couldn't worship side by side with their brother Israelites. What else is he wrong on? I mean, this just is a slap in the face to history. It doesn't say temple. It says kahal, assembly. So, what happened? Yes?
More quality control of the door.
Huh?
More quality control of the door.
Oh, okay. Well, I seem to recall that people tended to bathe before going to worship. You don't think that wouldn't have come about in the old mikveh hole? You think that maybe one of the reasons they had mikvahs in the first place was to make sure these guys got through and the others didn't? So we need to look at the history and be fair. Here's what happened. In Greek, it simply says eunuchos. And there's no other meaning for eunuchos other than eunuch. Now, grant you, Strong's became aware that this was a problem, and so they deliberately inserted an extra meaning that was never there of chamberlain or servant, right? But that was because this guy was the chamberlain for the Queen of Ethiopia. So it's kind of like shooting an arrow and drawing a target wherever the arrow lands. If you look in classical Greek going all the way back to Homer, eunuchos is eunuch, period. Doesn't mean anything else. And when it occurs in Matthew 19, for some were made eunuchs by Elohim and others became eunuchs by the hand of men, it only means eunuch. However, the Aramaic word, which is mahaimna, means eunuch, but also faithful one, believer. Why would they call this guy a faithful one? Because he's from Ethiopia. Can anyone tell me where the oldest continuous form of Judaism on the planet is right now? Thank you. Even older than the one in Babylon.
Actually, they're all, thanks to the Halleluyah flights, I think the last one now been relocated to Israel.
Right. Well, the fact that they're recognized as Jews by the nation of Israel, who spent hundreds of millions of dollars over 30 years to bring these people into Israel for what they called Operation Exodus. There's a hint. I think this speaks to the fact that they were really Jews. They probably got their Judaism from priests who were fleeing Manasseh. And that's a whole long story. But there's no other credible way to explain where they got their Judaism from. Because they still know how to sacrifice animals. They have a pre-temple Judaism intact in Ethiopia. And in the first century, these Jews from Ethiopia out-orthodoxed the Orthodox. They were known for their extra piety and being more conservative than the Pharisees that were in Israel. So therefore, they would have recognized this guy as a believer. A special kind of believer. Which is why the book of Acts goes to such great lengths to explain why it was such a fabulous thing that he became a disciple of Yeshua. So, again, you had one Aramaic word, Mahimna, means eunuch or believer. The Greek editor, whom I sometimes call Zorba, because he likes to dance around the truth sometimes, Zorba picked the wrong meaning and ran with it. And because otherwise, you have the first century Torah observant Messianics deliberately breaking Deuteronomy 23. Another good example, in the Gospel of John, I think somewhere in the 8th chapter, if I'm not mistaken, you had the Pharisees say, "We were never slaves." Never! We were never slaves. How then will you say that we shall be free? Really? Wasn't there something called the Exodus where you were slaves? So are the Pharisees in the first century so stupid that they've forgotten the central redemptive event in their whole history?
And that was, 70 years before that they came back from Babylon to the first century to Yeshua? How much time is in there?
I'm sorry.
The return of the Babylonian captivity to the first century.
Well, it's 500 years. Yeah. But my point is, if you look in Greek, the word is doulio, and doulio only has one meaning: slave. Period. However, in Aramaic, they make a distinction between slave and bondservant, one who works off a debt. And so that specific word in Aramaic says that they're saying we've never been in debt to anyone. We are a self-sufficient people, which makes sense because that's true. And so they're simply saying, look, we were never in debt. But Yeshua said, yes, you are, because you're in sin. See, the Lord's Prayer, the Sloth of Daman that you prayed, has the phrase Kab, which means forgive our sins, but it also can mean forgive our debts. Sin and debt is the same word, because to be in sin is to be in debt. You see? So that's why Yeshua says, if you are in sin, you are a slave to that sin. You are in debt. And if the Son of Man makes you free, you are free indeed. In another place in John, they say, no prophet has ever come out of Galilee. How about that one? That's right at the end of John 7. Look it up and see, Nicodemus. No prophet has ever come out of Galilee. Really? Is that true? I kind of remember Elijah came out of Galilee. Elisha, his assistant, came out of Galilee. Okay? Nahum, because they named the town after him. Capernaum came out of Galilee. Okay? How many prophets have to come out of Galilee before that stupid rabbi in the first century goes, you're right, that one came out of Galilee. No prophet ever came out of Galilee. So the Pharisees don't even know where 10 of their prophets come from. Does that make sense? I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense in Greek. What had happened was that they were talking about the Messiah, both before and after. And the Messiah was not called a prophet. The Messiah was called the prophet in Deuteronomy 18. And they're making the connection between what Moses called the Messiah. Hanavi, the prophet. And that's how the Aramaic reads. The prophet will not rise in Galilee. Because the word for rise, kum, can appear the same way in either past or future tense. And if you're not careful, you will get your tense wrong. So instead of a prophet has not come out of Galilee, it's the prophet will not come out of Galilee, because the prophet is Messiah, and Messiah is not supposed to be born in Galilee. He's supposed to be born where? According to Micah 5, Bethlehem in Judah. So, very, very simple. You cannot defend that reading in Greek because it's not historically accurate. And like I said, there's 491 more where those came from. And I'm not talking about just in the Gospels. I'm talking in the writings of Paul. I'm talking in Revelation. I'm talking in the book of the Hebrews. In Galatians. Everywhere. You point to a book, I can find you a proof. Pretty much. So, I could go on about that, but let me just wrap up at this particular point and just say, my intention here is not to kill the Greek, is not to get people to abandon studying the Greek, is not to say to the people that have studied New Testament Greek for 40 years, you're wrong. That's not where I'm coming from. It may be where some other folks in this movement are coming from, but it's not from me. So let me make that abundantly clear. My goal is not to destroy. My goal is to enrich, to add on to what you already have. See, if I just praise you guys for what you have, what good is that? I want to give you what you don't have. That's where the value is. That's why I drove, or my wife did rather, all the way from Georgia, y'all, to come up here. And though I've been, living in New York and Pennsylvania all of my life until last year, I ain't never been as far north as I am right now. So, the more ancient witnesses, the better. The more we study history, the better. Right? And the more we do that, the closer we draw to our Messiah, the closer we draw to our Creator. Eastern languages go east, Western languages go west. Thank you for your attention.